So we are finally here for our benchmarks and performance review of this Ryzen Mini-ITX system behind me. But before we get into any benchmarks or performance in general, a big shout out goes to Fractal Design for providing the Node 202 that you see, which is the chassis that you see there. They also provided a 450 watt power supply inside of that chassis to make this entire build possible. And in case you're wondering why I went with the Node 202 as the ITX enclosure here, it's mostly because of the extremely small form factor and the component density that it offers compared to other regular tower style ITX cases. I'm not really a big fan of those because of that point. I'd rather just get a micro ATX system instead. So I went with something that sort of resembles a console because it will live very well and very conveniently in a living room setup and just sort of blend in with its surroundings. Now, before we jump into gaming benchmarks of this system, I do want to remind you exactly what is inside of the computer. We have a Ryzen 5 1600 and it is running at 3.5 gigahertz and it is paired with 16 gigabytes of Corsair LPX RAM. In addition, we have an EVGA 1070 SC edition, so that is not a blower style cooler, and that actually comes in very important here in a minute when we talk about thermals of this particular system. And to the end of talking about thermals, there are two compartments within this case. There is a CPU side of things which houses the motherboard, processor, RAM, all those components, as well as the power supply unit. And on the other side of the chassis is the graphics card compartment, which basically just houses the graphics card itself. There is a couple cutouts in the center sort of divider that does allow you to run cables between the two sides. However, they are basically isolated from each other, and you can actually feel that when you just set your hand on top of the case itself. When it is running cool on the CPU side of things, the CPU side feels cool, but the graphics card side may feel extremely hot if it's running something like Furmark, for example. So under load, the processor will run at about 85 degrees Celsius, not messing with any fan curves or anything like that. I'm sure if I ran the fan at 100% all the time, I could get those thermals a little bit better, however, at the cost of some severe acoustics. So with that in mind, you will sort of see it difficult to overclock your Ryzen chips up into the 4 gigahertz range because, as we know, Ryzen chips are actually somewhat sensitive to temperature. On the other side of things, the graphics card also ran at about 90 degrees in the current configuration, which is that horizontal configuration that you see behind me. However, turning the case vertically did actually bring the temperatures back down to about 81 degrees Celsius. So if it's possible, and if you have no case fans in this chassis, then you may want to go ahead and try to run this in the vertical alignment, especially if you don't have that blower style cooler. I think what's sort of happening there is that hot air that after it gets ran through the cooler on the GPU, it's just sort of sitting in that GPU compartment and immediately getting recycled by the graphics card. By adding either a blower style cooler, that may help some, or even better yet, there is a couple of 120 millimeter fan brackets that are directly below the GPU. If you put in a fan or two there and just run that at low speed, that will do a good job of recycling that air, and then once it's through the graphics card, getting it out of the case through the side ventilation. So I'm going to give you a quick sound test of the system at idle and then the system at full load on the graphics card and the CPU at the same time, and then we'll just jump straight into those graphs for the gaming performance benchmarks. For our testing today, we are reverting to the loaded baked potato, and potato graph. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, basically anything over 60 FPS I am fully happy with, and that falls under the loaded baked potato category. Between 60 and 30 FPS is the baked potato category, which is pretty solid, but not the best, and anything under 30 FPS is really unacceptable and is just a potato. So moving on to the benchmarks. First up is League of Legends at 1080p and maximum settings, and we saw an average of 144 FPS with 1% lows at 96 and 0.1% lows at 76. All very good frame rates to see and a very good experience overall. Moving on to a faster paced game, CSGO, we saw an average of 221 FPS with 1% lows at 143 and and 0.1% lows at 117. Basically, to take full advantage of the power inside this PC, you're gonna need a very high refresh rate monitor, something in the 144 Hz range. Moving to another FPS shooter, we have Overwatch, averaging 100 FPS on the Epic preset at 1080p, 1% lows of 85, and 0.1% low clear up at 76 still, and obviously a great experience there as well. And rounding out our esports titles at 1080p, we have Rocket League averaging 228 FPS, 1% low at 124, and the 0.1% low at 72. Moving on to a couple more popular but maybe a little bit older games at this point, Skyrim Special Edition at 1080p, the Ultra preset, and that 60 FPS cap is in place from Bethesda. I did not remove that. We did see the average locked at 60 with 1% lows at 57 and 0.1% lows at 52, so obviously a very good experience there. And if you're wondering why that frame cap is in place, apparently if you drive FPS that is well above 100, it actually starts breaking some of the physics of games like Fallout and Skyrim because of the engine that's being used. So you can disable that frame cap, but do so at your own risk. And speaking of Fallout 4, it also has that cap rate of 60 on this particular monitor anyways, and we did see that average locked at 60 with 1% lows at 53 and 47 for our 0.1% low, and again, that was on the Ultra preset. And now for a few more intensive games, we have Grand Theft Auto 5 1080p on Ultra and high settings. We saw an average of 69 FPS with the 1% low at 43 and the 0.1% low at 37. And I would describe this as a very good gameplay experience, and considering that it is a single player game, at least in the mode that I was playing it in, that would be a phenomenal experience, a good combination of eye candy and frames. However, if you're playing multiplayer, you may want to tweak some of the settings in case you want to drive a higher frame rate than the 69 average. Moving over to Hitman, another single player game, we see an average of 75 on the Ultra settings at DirectX 11 and on the Paris level, with 1% lows at 49 and 0.1% lows at 43. And rounding out our 9 titles here, we have The Witcher 3 averaging 72, 1% low at 46, and 0.1% low at 34, and that was on the Ultra preset with the post-processing on the High preset. And hitting the reset button a little bit, but moving to 1440p, all other settings will remain the same throughout. We saw an average on League of Legends of 151. I'm not really sure what's going on with this title, as that's actually higher than the 1080p average, a 1% low of 102, and 0.1% low at 81. CSGO at 1440 averaged 179 FPS, 1% low at 95, and 0.1% low at 60. I know there are some of you out there that would rather play it at 1080p to get an even higher frame rate, specifically a higher 1% and 0.1% low frame rate. However, if you are wanting a little bit more eye candy out of the game and you have a 1440p capable monitor, then this setup would actually still serve you quite well. Overwatch is much the same story, whereas a lower 1080p resolution might get you more frames. At 1440p, we still see an average of 76, 1% low of 63, and 0.1% low, finally dipping just below that 60 mark at 58. And again, rounding out the esports titles at 1440p, we have Rocket League averaging 166 with a 1% low of 127 and 0.1% low at 67. With those frame rates, I see no reason not to run this particular title at its max settings at that 1440p resolution if you have the option. Now to Skyrim, where we still have that 60 FPS cap. We saw an average of 60 FPS, 1% low at 54 and a 0.1% low at 47. And moving over to Fallout 4, we had a frame cap of 75, which is imposed by my monitor, which is a 75 Hz monitor. We saw an average of 72 FPS, 1% low of 55, and 0.1% low of 50. Still a great overall experience. GTA 5 at 1440p was finally starting to really push this system to a little bit of its limits, seeing an average of 51, but 1% lows at 30 and 0.1% lows finally dipping below that 30 mark to 23. However, I would characterize the gameplay as still very good. Hitman saw a little bit better results at 1440p with an average of 70, 1% low of 49, and 0.1% low of 34. And again, rounding out our titles this time at 1440p, The Witcher 3 averaged 42 FPS, 1% lows at 33, and 0.1% lows, again dipping below the 30 mark down to 22. So that wraps up the Ryzen Mini-ITX performance review here. Obviously it packs in a lot of power in a very small form factor, and importantly to me at least, it gives me desktop quality components and performance that I can take on the go as easily as I could if I was just toting around a PS4 or an Xbox One. So it's a great gaming PC and a great workstation, all wrapped in together in one package. So if you like this content, then give me a like, share, subscribe, comment, all those things down below. Let me know in the comments what you think of the Ryzen ITX form factor here, and what type of mini ITX systems you might be putting together in the near future. You can also follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. They are the same tag for your convenience, and as always, we'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.